In the autumn of 1775, 1,100 men walked into the forests of Maine. They carried 45 days of food and a map that promised a march of 180 miles. The map was wrong. The real distance was closer to 350. And by the time the survivors staggered out of the trees and onto the bank of the St. Lawrence River, staring across black water at the stone walls of Quebec, nearly half of them were gone. Not killed in battle. Not yet. The enemy that almost destroyed this army never fired a shot. Consider that number. 1,100 men march into the wilderness. Around 600 come out the other side. 500 vanish into the gap between what a map promised and what the land actually was. Some turned back. Some fell sick. And some simply sat down in the snow, leaned against a tree, and did not get up again. This is not at first a story about a battle. It is a story about cold and hunger and water and rock and the slow arithmetic of starvation. It is a story about what a human body can be asked to give before it gives out. By the end of this video, you will understand how a routine diversion became one of the most brutal ordeals in American military history. You will learn why the maps betrayed these men before they ever set foot in the wilderness. Why 200 boats, built in a hurry from the wrong wood, became floating coffins for the Army's food. You will stand in a flooded camp on the night 300 men turned around and walked away, taking most of the provisions with them. And you will find out what starving soldiers put in their mouths when the last of the flour was gone. The dogs, the shoes, the leather cartridge boxes, the shaving soap scraped out of their own kits. I am going to show you 3 things that most retellings skip. First, the single logistical decision, made weeks before anyone went hungry, that quietly doomed the food supply. Second, the storm that should not have been there. And third, the vote, a council of war held in a flooded clearing by starving officers that split the army in two and decided, without anyone quite saying it out loud, who would live and who would go home. Here is what makes this so strange and so worth understanding. How does an army starve to death in a land full of rivers and forests and game? Why did experienced officers trust a 15-year-old map drawn by an enemy engineer? How did men who survived the impossible, who ate their own belts and forded ice-choked ponds and buried their comrades under piles of leaves, do all of that, only to fail at the very walls they had bled to reach? This was not a march about conquest. It was a march about endurance, about the men who kept walking long after walking should have been impossible. Before we step into the forest with them, take a second and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these forgotten stories. Then let us go back to the late summer of 1775, to a war only a few months old, and to a plan that looked, on paper, like the boldest stroke of the Revolution. To understand why anyone would send an army into that wilderness, you have to understand the shape of the war in the summer of 1775. The shooting had started in April, at Lexington and at Concord. By June, the situation had hardened into something like a siege. The British Army was bottled up in Boston, hemmed in by a ring of New England militia who had, almost overnight, become a Continental Army. George Washington took command of that army in July. And when he and the Continental Congress looked at the map of North America, they saw one thing that frightened them more than the redcoats in Boston. They saw Canada. Specifically, they saw the province of Quebec, vast, British, and, they believed, almost undefended. To the men in Philadelphia and in Cambridge, Quebec was not a distant curiosity. It was a loaded gun pointed at the back of their heads because British Canada gave the Crown a northern base, and from that base, an army could come south, down the Lake Champlain and Hudson River corridor, the ancient invasion highway of the continent. If the British drove a wedge down that corridor, they could cut New England off from the middle and southern colonies, divide the rebellion in half. And a rebellion cut in half is a rebellion that dies. So the question was not really, should we invade Canada? The question was, can we take it before they use it against us? There was reason for hope. On the 10th of May, 1775, a colonel named Benedict Arnold, together with Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, had pulled off a stunning stroke of their own. With a force of only 83 men, they had captured Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, the fortress that guarded the northern door into New York. They took its cannon, they took its powder, and they slammed that northern door shut, for the moment. Remember that name, Benedict Arnold. In 1775, it was not yet a curse. In 1775, it was the name of one of the most aggressive, most capable fighting men in the American cause. A former merchant, wealthy, restless, thin-skinned about honor, who had done business in Montreal and Quebec before the war and knew the ground and the people better than almost anyone in the army. After Ticonderoga, Arnold began to push hard. He petitioned Congress to authorize a full invasion of Canada. The British garrison in the entire province, he argued, numbered fewer than 600 regular troops. Fewer than 600 spread across a country. And the French-speaking Canadians, he insisted, would rise up and welcome the Americans as liberators from British rule. Congress hesitated. There is a difference between defending a rebellion and expanding it into a war of conquest, and the men in Philadelphia knew it. But the strategic logic would not let them go. In the summer of 1775, they yielded. They approved an invasion of Canada, and the plan they approved had two prongs. The Maine force, some 2,000 to 3,000 men, first under Major General Philip Schuyler, and then under the capable Irish-born Brigadier General Richard Montgomery, would take the traditional road. Up Lake Champlain, down the Richelieu River, against Montreal. It was the known route, the sane route. The second prong was neither known nor sane. A smaller force would strike directly at Quebec City itself, not by the rivers everyone used, but through the uncharted wilderness of what is now the state of Maine. A shortcut through country almost no European army had ever crossed. The idea was simple and audacious. This second force would appear suddenly out of the trees in front of the walls of Quebec, where no army was supposed to be able to come from. That shock alone would force the thinly stretched British governor, Guy Carleton, to split his handful of defenders, some to face Montgomery coming from Montreal, some to face this ghost army materializing out of the forest. And in that division, the Americans would take the crown jewel of British Canada and turn Quebec into what they were already calling the 14th colony. Someone had to command that second force, that march into the unknown. Benedict Arnold had been passed over for command of the Maine expedition. It stung. Everything stung Arnold. So he did what Arnold always did. He went straight to the top. He rode to Cambridge, to Washington's headquarters, and he made his case in person. "Give me the wilderness march," he said. "Give me the shortcut. Let me be the one who appears at the gates of Quebec." Washington looked at this driven, difficult, undeniably brilliant man, and he said yes. The map had promised one thing. The land was about to answer with another. But no one in Cambridge knew that yet. On paper, in the warm light of a Massachusetts September, it all still looked possible. Before we go into the forest, understand what was waiting at the end of it. Because Quebec was not just a target. Quebec was, in the 18th century, one of the great prizes of the North American continent, and everyone who mattered knew it. The city sat on a height of rock above the St. Lawrence River, a natural fortress improved by generations of engineers into one of the strongest positions on the continent. It commanded the river, and the river was the artery of Canada. Whoever held Quebec held the door to the whole interior. This was not abstract to the men planning the invasion. It had been proven in blood only 16 years earlier. In 1759, during the last great war between Britain and France, a British general named James Wolfe had spent an entire summer failing to take Quebec, until at last he pulled off a gamble so audacious it should not have worked. Landing his men in the dark and scaling the cliffs to the Plains of Abraham, the flat ground just outside the walls. There, in a battle that lasted barely 15 minutes, the British broke the French army. Both commanding generals, Wolfe and the Marquis de Montcalm, died of their wounds, and Canada passed from France to Britain. That single afternoon on the Plains of Abraham had redrawn the map of a continent. The Americans of 1775 knew that history intimately. Some of them had fought in that war on the British side as colonial troops. They knew that Quebec was the hinge on which Canada turned. And they knew that taking it was possible, because they had watched it happen. When Arnold's men eventually ferried across the river and formed up outside the walls, they would be standing on the exact ground where Wolfe had won an empire. The ghosts of that older battle hung over the whole enterprise. And there was the human calculation, the one Arnold kept pressing on Congress. Quebec was full of French-speaking Canadians, Catholic, conquered only a generation before, ruled now by a Protestant British crown they had no particular love for. Arnold and others were convinced these people would rise, or at least stand aside, and welcome the Americans as liberators. It was a seductive idea. It was also, as things turned out, wishful thinking. The Canadians, watching a ragged and starving American army arrive with no supplies and no cannon, mostly did the sensible thing and waited to see who would win before committing to anyone. Liberation is a great deal less attractive when the liberators are eating their own shoes. But in September of 1775, all of that lay in the unknowable future. What the planners saw was a fortress lightly held, a population possibly friendly, and a shortcut through the woods that could put an army where no army was expected. The prize justified the gamble. Quebec was worth a war. The only question, the question the map had already answered wrong, though no one knew it, was whether an army could actually get there. Before we walk into the forest, you need to know who was walking into it. Because the story of this march is not really the story of a plan. It is the story of the people who had to live inside that plan when it fell apart. Start with the commander himself. Benedict Arnold in 1775 was 34 years old, and he was the kind of man who seems built for exactly one thing and utterly unsuited to everything around it. He was a merchant by trade, but there was nothing merchant-like about him in the field. He was physically fearless to the point of recklessness. He was relentless. He drove himself harder than he drove his men, which is the rarest and most dangerous quality a commander can have. And he was proud. Proud in a way that would, years later, curdle into the most famous betrayal in American history. But that betrayal is 5 years in the future. In the autumn of 1775, Benedict Arnold was simply the most determined man in the American cause, and he was about to prove it in the worst conditions imaginable. His force was roughly 1,100 volunteers, drawn from the army camped around Cambridge. He divided them into 4 divisions, and each division tells you something about what this army actually was. A mix of hardened frontier killers and green New England farm boys who had never seen anything like what was coming. The vanguard belonged to Captain Daniel Morgan, and if this story has a second hero, it is him. Morgan was a giant of a man. a Virginia frontiersman they called the Old Wagoner from his days hauling supplies in the French and Indian War. He carried a grudge against the British in his very skin. Years before, a British officer had struck him, and Morgan had struck back, and the Army had sentenced him to 500 lashes for it. The story he liked to tell was that the drummer miscounted and only gave him 499, so the Crown still owed him one. He wore the scars of that whipping his whole life. And in July of 1775, he had raised a company of 96 riflemen from Winchester, Virginia, and marched them 600 miles to Cambridge in 21 days without losing a single man. They called it the Beeline March. His men were not musketeers. They carried long rifles, grooved, accurate, deadly, and they could hit a 7-inch target at 250 yards. To the New Englanders, who had never seen such shooting, it looked like witchcraft. To the British officers who would later face them, it looked like a nightmare. Morgan's riflemen wore Indian-style hunting shirts and moccasins, and they were tasked with the hardest job in the column, going first, cutting the path, scouting the unknown. Behind Morgan came the other 3 divisions. The second, under Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Green, was New England Musketeers, tasked with supporting the vanguard, and destined to suffer some of the worst starvation of the entire march. The third, under Major Return Jonathan Meigs, would keep a steady pace and build blockhouses along the way to serve as hospitals and supply depots. And the fourth, the rear guard, under Lieutenant Colonel Roger Enos, carried the majority of the expedition's reserve food, its medical supplies, and its heavy equipment. Hold on to that fact. The rear guard carried the food. It is going to matter more than almost anything else in this story. And then there were the men who came along, not because they had to, but because they were young and ambitious and hungry for a place in a war they believed was making history. A 19-year-old named Aaron Burr, yes, that Aaron Burr, a Princeton man who would one day become vice president and kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel, marched in this column as an untested boy. There was Captain Henry Dearborn, 24, from New Hampshire, whose careful daily journal is one of the reasons we know this story at all. There was Dr. Isaac Center, the expedition's young chief physician, who would record in clinical, unflinching detail exactly what starvation does to a human body. And there was John Joseph Henry, a runaway of 16, who joined the riflemen to fight for independence and lived to write one of the most vivid accounts of the ordeal that survives. There were women, too. History almost never mentions them, and it should. At least 2 women marched with this army into the wilderness, Mrs. Greer and Jemima Warner. And before the end, both of them would do things that shamed stronger men. These were the people, frontiersmen and farm boys, scholars and surgeons and runaways. 1,100 souls, most of them healthy, most of them optimistic, standing in the warm September sun with 45 days of food and a map. They did not know that the map was a lie. They did not know that the boats were already killing them. And still, they marched. Every disaster has a first cause. A single decision made early, in comfort, by people who could not see what it would become. For Arnold's expedition, there were 2, and both were locked in before the Army took a single step into the woods. The first was the map. To plan a march through country he had never seen, Arnold needed intelligence. And the best he could find was a 15-year-old document. It was a map and journal made in 1760 by a British military engineer named John Montresor, who had crossed part of the region during the last war. Arnold supplemented it with information from a local surveyor named Samuel Goodwin, a man whose loyalty to the crown was, let us say, an open question. From Montresor's map, Arnold made his calculations. The distance from the mouth of the Kennebec River to Quebec City, he concluded, was about 180 miles. 20 days of marching, give or take. He provisioned his army for 45 days, more than double his estimate, and felt he had built in a generous cushion against any delay. He had not. The map was catastrophically, almost unbelievably, wrong. Some historians suspect that Montresor, an enemy engineer, may have deliberately falsified parts of it. Smudged distances, omitted obstacles, precisely so that it would be useless to anyone who tried to follow it in a future war. Others point out that the region was simply brutally hard to survey, and honest errors could pile up fast. We will probably never know which it was. What we do know is the result. The real distance the men would have to travel was not 180 miles. It was closer to 350, and it ran through primeval forest, submerged bog, sheer mountain, and freezing rapids that no one on the American side had ever laid eyes on. Arnold had provisioned for a march roughly half the length of the one he was about to make. From the first day, whether anyone knew it or not, the food was never going to be enough. The second decision was quieter and in some ways worse. It was the boats. To carry the men and their supplies up the Kennebec and down the Chaudière, the plan called for bateaux, shallow, flat-bottomed riverboats, good for carrying cargo over water. Washington and Arnold contracted a Maine boat builder named Reuben Colburn to build 200 of them, and to build them fast, too fast. There was no time to season the wood. Colburn's crews were forced to build these 200 boats out of green, unseasoned pine. Wood cut so recently, it was still wet inside. Think about what that means. Green wood is heavy. These bateaux weighed upward of 400 pounds each, dead weight that men would have to drag against currents and haul over mountains on their shoulders. And green wood does something else. As it dries, it warps. It shrinks. The boards pull apart. The seams open. So from the moment these boats were battered against the first river rocks, they began to leak. Here is the chain reaction that one decision set off. The boats leaked. The water got into the cargo. The water dissolved the salt out of the salted pork, so the meat began to rot. The water soaked into the barrels of flour and ruined them. And the water crept into the gunpowder and caked it into useless solid blocks. An army marching to attack a fortified city was watching its food and its ammunition dissolve, slowly, in the bottoms of its own boats. This is the detail that most tellings rush past. Not the storm, not the cold. A boatyard decision made under deadline pressure, weeks before the first man went hungry. The green pine bateau did not just make the march harder. They preloaded the famine. They guaranteed that when the real trials came, the carries, the flood, the mountains, the men would face them already hollowed out, already short of food, already fighting on empty. The map set the distance they could not survive. The boats made sure they would face it starving, and not one man among the 1,100 knew it yet. They loaded their gear into 200 brand new boats, admired the fresh pale wood, and pushed off up the river in the last good weather of the year. The map had promised one thing. The land had not yet begun to answer, but it was about to. The army mobilized out of Cambridge between the 11th and 13th of September, 1775. They marched overland to the port of Newburyport, Massachusetts, in weather that was, of all things, blisteringly hot, sweltering. The men sweated through their shirts under a late summer sun, and if any of them had been told that within weeks they would be freezing to death, they would not have believed it. At Newburyport, they waited out fog and headwinds. And then, on the 18th and 19th of September, they boarded 11 small coastal vessels, a ragtag fleet of sloops and schooners with names like the Britannia, the Conway, the Hannah, the Eagle. They sailed 150 miles northeast, up the coast, to the mouth of the Kennebec River. It was a rough 12-hour passage, and these were landsmen, farm boys, and frontiersmen, not sailors. They were violently, helplessly seasick. So the march that was supposed to test the outer limits of human endurance began with an army that was already weakened, already emptied out, before it had walked a single mile of wilderness. Before they left, the Army's chaplain, the Reverend Samuel Spring, held a grand review and offered a long, solemn prayer. It is a small detail, but it tells you something. Everyone understood the gravity of what they were attempting. You do not pray that long over a routine march. You pray that long over men you are not sure you will see again. They pushed up the river to Fort Western, on the site of modern Augusta, Maine, and there they transferred everything into the 200 new bateaux. And there, at Fort Western, they were given a feast. A local notable named Esquire Howard hosted them, and the men ate 3 whole roasted bears, carved up by the expedition's own surgeons, along with smoked salmon, beef, pork, and golden pumpkin pies. They ate until they were full. They laughed. They felt for one night like an army on an adventure. It was the last real meal most of them would eat for nearly 2 months. Remember the pumpkin pies? There will come a day, deep in the mountains, when a man would have traded his musket, his boots, and very nearly his soul for a single bite of that fort. Then the river turned on them. The ascent of the Kennebec destroyed their optimism almost at once. A severe summer drought had dropped the river's level, and where there should have been smooth water, there were now exposed rocks, jagged, endless, everywhere. Sailing was impossible. Rowing was treacherous. Again and again, the men were forced to climb out of the boats and into the freezing river and drag the 400-pound bateau against the current by their tow ropes, stumbling over unseen stones, soaked to the chest in water already carrying the first bite of autumn. And the river had teeth. It was punctuated by a series of impassable waterfalls, each one requiring a portage, a carry. Taconic Falls, Skowhegan Falls, Norridgewock Falls, Caratunk Falls. At each one, the Army had to stop, unload every boat completely, hoist the supplies and the monstrous boats onto their shoulders, stagger over steep and broken ground made of exposed rock worn by ages, carry it all to the calmer water above the falls, and then reload and start again. Over and over and over. The toll was immediate, and it was physical. The sheer effort of lifting those waterlogged pine boats tore muscles and broke men down. And every time the bateau slammed against the rocks in the rapids, the green wood split a little more along its seams. The leaking water got into everything. It dissolved the salt out of the pork. It ruined the flour. It caked the powder into useless bricks. By the time the Army reached the edge of the last settlements, the last place where a man could look back and see a farmhouse, the famine that would define this march had already been quietly sown in the bottoms of the boats. There was fear now, too, seeping into the ranks. Scouts brought back rumors of a Mohawk war party near the Canadian border, rumors said to have been planted by a Norridgewock man named Natanis, believed to be a spy for Governor Carleton. Arnold dismissed the reports, but the men heard them, and in the deepening cold and the endless labor, the rumors gnawed. They were leaving the known world behind, and still they marched. Beyond Caratunk Falls, the Kennebec bent away from where they needed to go. To reach the Dead River, the western tributary that would carry them toward Canada, The army had to leave the water entirely and cross overland. This crossing had a name, given long before by the indigenous peoples who knew this country far better than any of Montresor's maps. The Great Carrying Place. It was 13 miles of roadless wilderness. 13 miles that included 3 isolated ponds and a punishing climb. An elevation gain of well over 1,000 feet, most of it packed into the very first stretch. And across those 13 miles, the Army had to carry everything: the supplies, the gear, and the boats. The 400-pound green pine boats, up and over the shoulders of the men who were already breaking down. Morgan's riflemen went first, as always, swinging axes and tomahawks to hack a rough path through dense thickets of spruce and cedar and hemlock, trees so tightly grown that a man could barely push between them. The divisions behind them carried the boats and the tons of supplies on their backs. And when the ground finally leveled out, it did not get easier. It got worse. Because the level ground was bog, vast spruce swamps of freezing black mud and moss. Under the weight of the boats, the men sank to their knees in it. The mud gripped their legs. Submerged roots caught their feet and held them. Every step had to be torn free from the swamp before the next one could be taken. This is where the health of the Army began to collapse in earnest. Constant immersion in freezing water. Enormous expenditure of calories they no longer had to spare. The result was predictable, and it was grim. Dysentery, rheumatism, pneumonia, sweeping through the ranks. Men who had feasted on roasted bear a week before were now shivering, fevered, and failing. Arnold saw it, and he ordered Major Meigs to build a log blockhouse between the first and second ponds, a place to shelter the sick and the broken. The men gave it a name that was half grim joke and half prophecy. They called it Arnold's Hospital. It was the first structure the American Army built specifically to hold the people the wilderness had already defeated. The portage swallowed 5 to 7 days for each division, because no man could carry everything at once. They had to make trip after trip after trip. Set down one load, walk back across the bog, pick up another, cross again. Every mile of the Great Carrying Place was walked several times over. Do the arithmetic of that. 13 miles, carried in relays, meant 50, 60, 70 miles of actual walking through freezing swamp under crushing loads. For 13 miles of progress on the map. When the vanguard finally slid their battered boats into the slow, dark water of the Dead River on the 16th of October, they were exhausted in a way that goes past the physical. They were a diminished army, sick, hungry, wet to the bone. And they believed, God help them, that the worst was behind them. It was not. It was in front of them, and it was coming fast, out of the south, on the wind. The Dead River earned its name from its current, which was so slow as to be almost invisible. After the murder of the Great Carrying Place, it felt like mercy. The water was smooth and deep, overhung by thick canopies of forest. And for a few days, the exhausted men simply floated, rowing gently through still water, and let themselves believe, again, that the ordeal was easing. Then the sky went dark. On the 19th of October, a great storm slammed into the Maine wilderness. Some later accounts have called it a hurricane blown far off its course. A tropical storm that had no business being that far north, that late in the year. We cannot say for certain what it was. What the men's own journals record is simpler and no less terrible. The skies opened and did not close. Torrential rain fell in sheets for days. Howling winds out of the south-southwest tore full-grown pines and hemlocks up by their roots and hurled them down into the river and into the camps. The men abandoned the shelter of the trees because the trees were now weapons, falling and crashing all around them. and they huddled instead in open, flooding clearings under crude huts of bark. And then, on the night of the 21st of October, the river itself rose up to kill them. The dead river drains a wide bowl of surrounding mountains, and all the water the storm had dumped on those mountains now came rushing down at once. In a matter of hours, the river rose 8 to 9 feet. It burst its banks. The slow, dead water became a raging torrent that spread out a full mile wide through the forest. Men asleep on what they had thought was safe ground woke to freezing water pouring into their tents and had to scramble in the dark, in the flood, for any rise of ground still above the surface. When dawn finally came, it showed them ruin. Several bateaux had been smashed against rocks or torn away by the current, and with them went a huge portion of the Army's last reserves. Barrels of powder, of pork, of flour, gone downstream into the flood. The river had also carved itself a new violence, sweeping now through a narrow gorge flanked by rocky ledges, a sluiceway that the boats could not run, forcing the men into long, exhausting detours over land. Look at where they now stood, stranded in a flooded wilderness, cut off from the logistical lifeline they had been dragging for a month. Their food gone with the flood or ruined by the leaking boats. And behind all of it, unspoken and undeniable, the calendar. It was late October in the north. Winter was not coming. Winter had arrived. The maps had failed them. The boats had failed them. And now the very sky had turned against them. Everything that could break had broken. And still, sick, soaked, starving, standing in a mile-wide flood in the first snows of a Canadian winter, still, they marched. But not all of them, because the flood forced a reckoning, and in a camp so miserable the surgeon named it after madness, the Army was about to tear itself in two. The storm had done more than wreck the boats. It had broken the momentum of the entire expedition, and it forced a decision that Arnold had been outrunning for weeks. The lead divisions, Morgan's, Green's, Meiggs's, were now essentially out of food. Not low, out. And Arnold, being Arnold, chose the only move his nature allowed. He did not sit down to ration and wait. He drove forward. He took a tiny advance party, 15 men in a canoe and a few remaining boats, and pushed ahead to scout the route over the height of land and to reach the French-Canadian settlements beyond, where there was food, where there was rescue. If only he could get to it in time. But behind the vanguard, at the back of the strung-out, suffering column, the crisis came to a head. On the 25th of October, the rear guard finally caught up. Lieutenant Colonel Roger Enos, commanding the 4th Division, reached Christopher Green's starving 2nd Division at a flooded, miserable encampment that Dr. Center had bitterly named Hydrophobus. And here is the terrible irony at the heart of what happened next. Enos's rear guard held the vast majority of the expedition's remaining supplies, the food, the medicine, the reserves. All of it was concentrated in the one division farthest from the fighting edge of the Army. So the officers held a council of war. The question was brutal and simple. Do we go on, or do we turn back? Arnold's standing written orders had been clear. Send the sick to the rear and press forward only with the men who could be provisioned for 15 days. But the grim mathematics of that flooded camp made his order meaningless. If you took all the food that was left and divided it evenly among all the men who were left, it would not feed the Army for 15 days. It would not feed them for 5. There was simply not enough. The order assumed a world that no longer existed. In the council itself, Enos actually cast his vote to push forward, to continue. But that vote was immediately overturned, not by Arnold, who was miles ahead, but by Enos's own subordinate officers. His captains, McCobb, Williams, and Scott, held an informal, mutinous council of their own, and they flatly refused. They would not march their men into what they saw as certain death in a frozen wilderness with no food. And faced with a command that would not obey him, Enos folded. He reversed his position. His duty, he now decided, was to lead his men back home to Massachusetts. And so the rear guard turned around. Roughly 300 men, the lion's share of the medical supplies, the lion's share of the food, all of it, turning south, walking back the way they had come. Green's starving officers begged, they pleaded, they reproached Enos to his face. And in the end, before he marched away, Enos surrendered to the men he was abandoning a total of 2.5 barrels of flour. 2.5 barrels for roughly 700 men about to attempt the deadliest stretch of the entire journey. Now, here the honest historian has to slow down, because this is the beat everyone gets wrong. It is easy to call Roger Enos a coward and a villain, and history mostly has. When he got back to Cambridge, he was met with open contempt, accused of desertion, and hauled before a court-martial in December on the charge of quitting without leave. But he was acquitted. The military tribunal looked hard at the mathematics of that flooded camp and concluded that Enos was right about the arithmetic, if not about the honor. There genuinely was not enough food for all 1,100 men to survive. Had the whole army stayed together and shared equally, the whole army might have starved together. So sit with the awful paradox of it. Enos's decision condemned the remaining 700 men to a level of starvation almost beyond imagining. And at the same time, by removing 300 mouths from the food supply, that same decision may be the only reason any of the vanguard lived at all. The retreat that looked like betrayal may also have been, by cold accident, the thing that made survival possible for the men who stayed. That is the cruelty of this march in a single moment. There was no clean choice. There was only a flooded camp, a handful of flour, and a line drawn through an army. The men who would go forward into the horror, and the men who would go home to be called cowards. Both sets of men were, in their way, simply trying not to die. The vanguard took its 2.5 barrels of flour, turned its back on the men marching south, and faced the mountains. And still, they marched. Stop for a moment and consider the strangeness of what we are watching. Every other great military ordeal has a villain you can point to, a general on the other hill, an army you can name and count, a face for the thing that is trying to kill you. But for most of this story, Arnold's men had no such enemy. There was no opposing commander in the forest, no cavalry, no cannon, no shield wall. The British in Quebec did not even know for certain that this army existed until it was nearly on top of them. And yet something was destroying this force with more efficiency than any army could have managed. It killed by cold. It killed by water. It killed by exhaustion and dysentery, and the slow subtraction of calories from bodies that had none to spare. It could not be charged, or outflanked, or forced to surrender. It had no morale to break and no supply line to cut. It was the land itself, and the season, and the simple physics of a body burning more than it can take in. This is the thing that makes wilderness campaigns so uniquely terrible and so rare in the history books. A soldier can nerve himself to face another soldier. Men have always found ways to stand against arrows and bullets and steel, because those enemies can be beaten. And courage feels like it means something against them. But how do you fight cold? How do you charge a river? What good is a rifle that can kill a man at 250 yards against a swamp that swallows your legs? Or a hunger that hollows you out from the inside? Morgan's marksmen were the deadliest men on the continent, and their skill was worth exactly nothing against the thing that was actually killing them. There is a particular kind of despair in that. To be a fighting man, trained and armed and brave, and to be destroyed by something you cannot fight. The journals catch it, the way the men's language shifts over the weeks, from the confidence of soldiers on campaign to something older and smaller and more human. The language of people simply trying to survive weather. By the mountains, they were no longer really an army. They were a group of human beings enduring an environment that wanted them dead. And the only weapon any of them had left was the refusal to stop walking. Keep that in mind for what comes next. Because what comes next is the point where the enemy, with no army, very nearly finished the job. What lay ahead of the 700 was the worst of it. The absolute worst. To reach Canada, they now had to cross the height of land, the rugged, snow-covered Appalachian ridge that divides the rivers flowing back toward Maine from the rivers flowing north into the St. Lawrence. It was the spine of the wilderness, and it was a labyrinth of frozen swamps, sheer rocky precipices, and false river branches that led nowhere. The temperature collapsed. The bateaux, those cursed leaking boats, were now mostly abandoned or destroyed. There was no more river to carry them and no more strength to haul them. So the men went on foot, overland, through what they came to call the terrible carry. Captain Hanchet's company waded 2 full miles through the freezing outlet of a lake. The water so cold it took all sensation from their legs, and they had to be ferried the last stretch to solid ground at midnight in the few boats that remained. Men without proper shoes wrapped their splitting, bleeding feet in rags and left a trail of blood in the fresh snow. Whole companies, Meigs's men, Green's men, blundered into a swamp trap and wandered for days through spruce and cedar and hemlock, so thick they lost all sense of direction, circling, doubling back, dying. Men too weak to stand fell headlong down the rock faces. They lost their muskets in the snowdrifts. They lay down in the mountain mire and did not rise. And through all of it ran the hunger. By now it was not discomfort. It was the central fact of every man's existence. The daily ration had been cut to a half pint of flour, which the men mixed with water and baked on hot coals without so much as a pinch of salt to make it bearable. And then even that ran out. What they did next, the journals recorded, because the men who lived through it wanted the world to know exactly what the wilderness had asked of them. According to the accounts of Dr. Isaac Center and Captain Henry Dearborn, when the last flour was gone, the starving soldiers killed and ate Captain Dearborn's dog. It was a large Newfoundland, a faithful animal that had followed the army all the way from Massachusetts. The men consumed it entirely. Not just the meat, but the entrails, the feet, the skin. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. When you have not eaten in days, a dog is not a pet. A dog is life. When the dog was gone, they ate their equipment. They boiled and chewed their leather cartridge boxes. They gnawed on their moccasins. They cut up and boiled the raw moose hide they had been carrying to repair their shoes, and ate that. Dr. Center recorded, with a physician's flat precision, that the men consumed their shaving soap, their lip salve, their hair pomatum, a grease made from bear fat, swallowed simply to have something, anything, moving through their bodies. There is a threshold past which the distinction between food and not food stops meaning anything. These men were far, far past it. Private Freeman Judd wrote that men were driven half mad by the combination of dysentery and the agony of walking barefoot through snow. And he described the way some of them died. A man would stop. He would sit down against a tree, out of the wind, and he would not get up. His comrades, too weak to carry him and too broken to argue, would sometimes read a passage of scripture over him where he sat, still breathing, and then walk on. And the man would surrender, quietly, to the cold, and to the hunger, and to sleep. That is what starvation looks like from the inside. Not a dramatic collapse. A man sitting down against a tree in the snow, listening to the Bible and letting go. And in the middle of all this horror, there were the two women, and what they did should never be forgotten. Mrs. Greer waded waist-deep through a pond crusted with a half-inch of ice, holding her skirts up out of the freezing water to reach firm ground on the far side. And she did it without complaint. And Jemima Warner's husband James, collapsed from exhaustion and starvation and could go no farther. She stayed with him, and when he died, she had no shovel and no strength to dig. So she covered his body with a pile of autumn leaves. Then she picked up his musket, turned toward Canada, and walked 20 miles alone through that wilderness to catch up with the column. 20 miles, carrying her dead husband's gun, after burying him under leaves. If you want to know what held the American cause together through its darkest years, it was not the generals, and it was not the strategy. It was that. It was Jemima Warner picking up the musket. It was 700 starving scarecrows who had every reason on earth to lie down in the snow, and who, day after impossible day, chose instead to stand up and keep going. And still, eating their dogs, eating their shoes, burying their dead under leaves, still they marched. While the main body of the army was dying by inches in the mountains, one man was gambling everything on speed. Benedict Arnold, with his advance party of 15, had pushed on ahead precisely so that he could reach help and send it back before the whole expedition perished. But between him and the settlements lay the Chaudière River, and the Chaudière was a monster. The name is French for boiler, and the river deserved it. It dropped nearly 600 feet over some 50 miles of violent, rock-choked rapids. And Arnold's party had no local guides. They ran it blind. For the first stretch, they rode a swift sheet of black water over an overflowed forest, moving faster than any of them had moved in weeks. But the current kept building until it was too fierce to steer at all. The men could not dip a paddle or plant a setting pole against the riverbed. They were simply passengers now, hostages of the water, hurtling downstream with no control. And then the river funneled into a gorge, and the banks reared up steep on either side, and the boats were sucked into a violent whirlpool at a place called the Falls of Saul. The bateau went over a 30-foot waterfall onto the rocks below and shattered. It should have killed them all. Somehow, it did not. The men swam to the edges of the deep pool below the falls and dragged themselves out, alive. But they had lost at nearly everything, including Arnold's own boat and most of the party's remaining gear. So Arnold did the only thing Arnold ever did. He got up, soaking and half frozen, and he kept going, now on foot, through the snow. On the 30th of October, he reached the French-Canadian settlement of Sardigan, 60 miles short of the St. Lawrence. And here, at last, the merchant's old life paid off. Arnold had done business in this country before the war. He knew how to buy, and he knew whom to buy from. He purchased cattle, horses, hundreds of pounds of flour. And on the 31st of October, he sent a relief party. French Canadians and native guides driving that food back up the river trail toward the dying army. They found the leading edge of Arnold's men just in time. Just in time, and not a moment sooner. The relief party came upon soldiers who had collapsed in the snow, who were hallucinating, who had lain down to die, and they revived them, there on the trail, with roasted meat and boiled oatmeal, pressing food into the hands of men who had days before been eating their own boots. there are accounts of men weeping at the sight of an animal being butchered, at the simple, unbearable fact of a meal. Make no mistake about what this means. Without Arnold's furious forward dash, without a commander reckless and driven enough to run a killer river blind and then walk 60 miles through snow to buy cows, the entire expedition would almost certainly have died in the Maine wilderness. Every man of them. The march would have ended not with an assault on Quebec, but with 700 frozen bodies scattered across the mountains, and a mystery that no one would ever fully solve. Arnold's relentlessness had very nearly killed his men a dozen times over. In the end, that same relentlessness is the only reason any of them lived. The survivors ate. They slept. Slowly, over days, the food and the Canadian hospitality brought them back from the edge. And then, gaunt and hollow-eyed but alive, they gathered themselves for the last stretch, down out of the mountains, toward the great river, toward the city they had crossed hell to reach. The wilderness had taken its price. Now the walls of Quebec were waiting to take theirs. Pause here, on the near side of the great river, and look hard at the man who dragged this army through hell. Because everything that happens next, and everything that happened to Benedict Arnold for the rest of his life, is written into how he led this march. Most commanders, faced with what Arnold faced, would have turned back. That is not a criticism. It is simply the truth. A prudent officer, watching his food ruined, his boats destroyed, a flood tear through his camp, a third of his army desert, and his men reduced to eating leather, would have concluded that the mission was impossible and saved the lives he could. Roger Enos concluded exactly that, and a court of his peers agreed he was reasonable. Prudence said, turn back. The arithmetic said, turn back. Every rational voice in that wilderness said, turn back. Arnold did not have that voice. Whatever the wiring is that lets a man weigh a goal against the cost of reaching it and decide the cost is too high, Arnold simply did not possess it. Where another commander saw impossibility, Arnold saw an obstacle to be attacked harder. When the boats failed, he pushed on. When the food ran out, he did not ration and wait. He ran ahead, alone, down a river that shattered his boats over a waterfall. And then he walked 60 miles through snow to buy cattle with his own credit and drove the food back up the trail to his dying men. There is no version of this expedition that succeeds even partially without a commander built exactly like that. His refusal to quit is, quite literally, why anyone lived. And here is the uncomfortable thing you have to hold in your mind, knowing what you know about how his story ends. The very quality that made Arnold heroic in the Maine wilderness, that absolute, unbending, all-consuming drive, that inability to accept that the world might tell him no, is the same quality that, 5 years later, drove him into the most infamous treason in American history. The man who would not accept that the wilderness could beat him also could not accept that his country could slight him, overlook him, fail to reward him as he believed he deserved. The pride that carried 700 starving men to the walls of Quebec was the same pride that would one day carry Benedict Arnold to the British side. We will follow him there, at the end. But stand with him for now, on the bank of the St. Lawrence, at the summit of his life. Bleeding is still ahead of him. Betrayal is still years away. Right now, he is simply the man who did the impossible thing, who looked at a wilderness that had killed half his army and decided, against all reason, that he would cross it anyway, and did. Whatever he became later, he was that first. Hold both. History requires it. On the 9th of November, 1775, the ragged remnant of Arnold's army reached Point Levis, on the southern bank of the St. Lawrence River, directly across the water from Quebec City. They had covered roughly 350 miles in 45 days. The exact span of rations Arnold had once believed would carry them the whole way, with room to spare. Every one of those 45 days had been spent on a march he had estimated at 20. Look at what had become of the 1,100. Only about 600 now stood on that riverbank. The rest were gone, dead in the mountains, turned back with Enos, invalided out, lost to sickness and swamp and cold. Half the army, erased before it ever saw the enemy. And the 600 who remained did not look like an army at all. The British observers across the river were genuinely stunned by the sight of them. They could hardly believe that men could have come through the bogs and the precipices and the famine and still be walking. One account called it a miracle. These were not soldiers in the ordinary sense anymore. They were emaciated scarecrows in rotting hunting shirts and rag-wrapped feet, hollow-cheeked, wild-eyed, held together by nothing but will. And they had arrived, impossibly, exactly where they were supposed to be, at the gates of the crown jewel of British Canada. But arriving was not the same as winning, and Arnold knew it. He had no artillery. Not a single cannon had survived the wilderness. His men's gunpowder had been ruined by the leaking boats and the flood. Much of it was useless. He faced a walled city, well provisioned, its defenses freshly stiffened by the arrival of a veteran Scottish officer named Alan MacLean and his Royal Highland emigrants. Governor General Guy Carleton, who would take overall command of the city's defense, had not yet even reached Quebec. He would arrive a few days later, on the 19th of November, and immediately take charge. And a mile of cold, British-patrolled river separated Arnold from the walls. Still, he tried. He gathered up native dugout canoes, and on the nights of the 13th and 14th of November, under cover of darkness, he ferried his shrunken army across the great river to the Plains of Abraham, the same ground where, 16 years earlier, Wolfe had beaten Montcalm and won Canada for Britain. And then Arnold did the only thing a man with no cannon and wet powder could do. He bluffed. He marched his scarecrows up to the city and demanded its surrender. The garrison would not even dignify the demand with a reply. And Arnold, for all his aggression, was not a fool. He could see that his force was far too weak to storm the walls or mount a real siege. So he pulled back, 20 miles upriver to Pointe-aux-Trembles, to wait for the other prong of the invasion, to wait for Richard Montgomery. And Montgomery was coming. On the 13th of November, the very day Arnold began crossing the river, Montgomery had captured Montreal. Now he came downriver to join forces, and in the first days of December, the two American columns finally met. Montgomery brought roughly 300 troops. He brought artillery. He brought provisions. And, in a small mercy that says everything about the state of Arnold's men, he brought captured British winter uniforms, so that the survivors of the Death March could finally take off their rags and be warm. The combined force, around 1,200 men now, turned back toward Quebec to lay siege to the city. But the situation was deteriorating faster than they could exploit it, and 3 separate clocks were all running down at once. The first clock was the ground. The Canadian winter had frozen the earth so hard that the Americans could not dig proper siege trenches. You cannot besiege a fortress by conventional means if you cannot break the ground to shelter your men and your guns. The second clock was disease. Smallpox had broken out in the American camp, and it began to move through the ranks of half-starved, exhausted men like fire through dry grass. Every day, the besieging army grew smaller and sicker. And the third clock was the calendar, and it was the cruelest of all. The enlistment contracts of Arnold's New England men were set to expire at the stroke of midnight on the 31st of December, 1775. At that moment, legally, most of the army was free to go home. Montgomery understood the math with perfect, awful clarity. If he did not attack before the new year, his army would simply dissolve in his hands, walk away, contracts fulfilled, and leave him standing in the snow in front of Quebec with no one to command. So the decision made itself. They could not wait for spring. They could not wait for reinforcements. They could not wait for the smallpox to burn out or the ground to thaw. They had to attack. And they had to do it before midnight on New Year's Eve. With a sick and shrinking army against a walled city held by a larger force. The men who had crossed a wilderness that should have killed them all were now going to be thrown against stone walls in the dead of a Canadian winter. They would go in under cover of a blizzard. And the blizzard, like the map and the boats and the storm before it, was about to become one more thing that turned against them. Before the snow begins to fall, it is worth understanding coldly and clearly why this attack was so unlikely to succeed. Because the tragedy of the assault on Quebec is not that it was badly fought. It was, in places, brilliantly fought. The tragedy is that it was launched from a position where even brilliance was probably not enough. Start with the fortress itself. Quebec was one of the strongest defensive positions in North America, and the defender's math is always favorable. Military planners have long used a rough rule that a besieging force wants to outnumber the defenders by something like 3 to 1 to have a real chance of taking fortified works by storm. Arnold and Montgomery had the ratio inverted. They were attacking roughly 1,800 defenders behind walls with about 1,200 men in the open. And their 1,200 were not fresh troops. They were survivors of a death march and a smallpox camp, some of them still hollow from starvation. The raw numbers alone made this a long shot. Then subtract the tools of a proper siege. A besieging army reduces a fortress by digging approaches and battering the walls with artillery until a breach appears. The Americans could do neither. The Canadian winter had frozen the ground so hard that they could not dig siege trenches at all. And the artillery Montgomery brought was nowhere near enough to breach walls like Quebec's. With no way to dig and no way to batter, a conventional siege was simply off the table. That is why it had to be a storm. A sudden, violent, all-or-nothing rush at the defenses in the dark. Not because a night assault was a good plan, but because it was the only plan left. Now add the enlistment clock, because it poisoned everything. Montgomery could not choose his moment. He could not wait for spring, for reinforcements, for the smallpox to burn out, for a weakness to open in the defense. His army would legally dissolve at midnight on New Year's Eve. So the timing of the attack was dictated not by opportunity, but by desperation. Attack now, tonight, in whatever conditions exist, because tomorrow there may be no army to attack with. An assault launched on a deadline rather than on an opening is an assault fighting uphill before the first shot. And finally, understand the fragile geometry of the plan itself. A two-pronged night assault in a blizzard depended on perfect coordination between two columns that could not see each other and could barely communicate. The entire concept rested on both attacks succeeding more or less simultaneously, so that the defender would be forced to split his strength. But the reverse was also true, and it was the fatal flaw. If either prong failed, the defender could turn his whole force against the other. The plan had no resilience. It worked only if everything worked. And in war, on a night like the one that was coming, something always fails. None of this means the men were wrong to try. Given the clock and the cold and the walls, they had run out of good options and were choosing the least bad one. But it does mean that when we watch what happens in the lower town, Montgomery falling, Arnold carried bleeding from the field, Morgan trapped in the streets, we should understand that the seeds of that failure were planted before the first man stepped off Ave into the snow. The assault did not fail because the men were not brave enough. It failed because bravery was being asked to overcome walls, weather, numbers, disease, and time all at once. That is a great deal to ask, even of men who had already crossed a wilderness that should have killed them. Now let the snow fall. In the black early hours of the 31st of December, a heavy snow began to fall. Montgomery had been waiting for exactly this. A blizzard would blind the defenders on the walls and hide the movement of his columns. So, under the roar of the storm, the Americans launched their desperate, two-pronged assault on the lower town of Quebec, the waterside district beneath the great fortified height of the upper town. The plan was for two columns to strike the lower defenses from opposite directions, breach them, converge in the lower town, and then push up together into the heavily fortified upper city. Montgomery would lead the primary assault from the southwest, along the shore of the St. Lawrence, with around 300 men. Arnold would lead the secondary assault from the northeast, around 600 men, Morgan's riflemen at the front, storming the northern barricades, fighting through the lower town, and linking up with Montgomery in the middle. Against them, Carleton held the city with something like 1,800 men behind the walls. The Americans were attacking a larger force in a fortified position, in a blizzard, in the dark. Montgomery went first, leading his column along the narrow, ice-slick shoreline beneath the cliffs. It was treacherous going, a thin ribbon of frozen rock between the wall and the river. His vanguard pushed forward toward a barricade and a blockhouse that guarded the way. But the defenders were not asleep. The city's bells were ringing the alarm, and somewhere in the dark, an American lantern was accidentally exposed. And the British gunners in the blockhouse knew exactly where the column was. They waited until Montgomery's men were almost on top of them, and then, at point-blank range, they fired. A single blast of grape shot tore into the head of the American column. Richard Montgomery was killed instantly, cut down in the first volley, along with his aides John McPherson and Jacob Cheeseman. The general who had taken Montreal, the charismatic leader the whole southwestern assault depended on, was dead in the snow before he had even breached the wall. And with him died his column's nerve. Leaderless, shocked, pinned in a killing ground on that narrow shore, the New York troops broke. They panicked and fell back in disorder, led away from the slaughter by subordinate officers, among them the young Aaron Burr, who would carry the memory of this night for the rest of his long and infamous life. In a matter of minutes, one entire half of the American attack had simply collapsed. Montgomery's assault was over before it began. But Arnold, on the other side of the lower town, knew none of this. He was driving his 600 men against the northern barricades in the teeth of the storm. And early in that assault, disaster struck him too. A British musket ball smashed into Arnold's lower leg, shattering the bone and severing an artery. Blood poured out into the snow. Arnold, of course, refused to leave. He stayed on his feet, shouting his men forward until he had lost so much blood that he physically could not stand, and his soldiers had to carry him bodily to the rear, to the hospital, still giving orders as they hauled him away. Command of the column fell, at that moment, to Daniel Morgan, the old wagoner, the man who had led the vanguard through every mile of the wilderness. And Morgan did what Morgan was born to do. He rallied the riflemen and threw himself at the barricade. He scaled a siege ladder straight up into the muzzles of British muskets. A ball passed clean through his hat and grazed his cheek and knocked him backward off the ladder into a snowbank. and Morgan got up, climbed back onto the ladder, and went over the wall. He captured the first British battery. He drove his men deep into the narrow, twisting, snow-choked streets of the lower town, fighting house to house, pressing toward the link-up that was supposed to come, toward Montgomery. But Montgomery was dead. His column was gone, and that changed everything. Because Montgomery's attack had failed, Governor Carleton was suddenly free to do the one thing that wins a battle like this. He concentrated. With no threat left on the southwestern side, Carleton turned his entire defensive force against Morgan's isolated column. British troops sortied out from the upper town, swung around behind the Americans, and cut off their line of retreat. Morgan and his men, who had fought their way brilliantly into the heart of the lower town, now found themselves trapped inside it, surrounded in a maze of stone buildings, hemmed in by overwhelming fire from every direction, their powder wet, their numbers falling, no reinforcement coming, and no way back out. There is a story, and it is probably true, that Morgan refused to surrender to the British at all, that he stood with his back against a wall, weeping with rage, and handed his sword instead to a French-Canadian priest in the crowd rather than give it to the enemy soldiers closing in. Whether or not the detail is exact, the outcome is not in doubt. Trapped, out of options, out of everything but courage, Morgan and more than 400 American soldiers were forced to lay down their arms and surrender. It was over. The two-pronged assault that was supposed to win the 14th colony had ended with one general dead in the snow. The other carried bleeding from the field. And the bravest fighting men in the army herded into captivity inside the very city they had crossed a wilderness to reach. They had beaten the maps. They had beaten the boats. They had beaten the flood and the mountains and the famine. They had eaten their dogs and their shoes and buried their dead under leaves and marched anyway. And at the last wall, in the last hour of the last day of the year, the impossible march ran out of miracles. When the shooting stopped and the snow settled over the lower town, the accounting was brutal and it was one-sided. The Battle of Quebec was a catastrophe for the Continental Army, the first major defeat of the Revolutionary War. The Americans lost roughly 50 men killed, another 30-odd wounded, and the number that truly broke the army, well over 400 captured. Morgan's entire column, the hard core of the wilderness veterans, was now inside British prison walls. Against all of that, Carleton's defenders had suffered only a handful of casualties. A few killed, a few wounded. The disparity tells the whole story of what it means to throw a sick, exhausted, ill-equipped force against a fortified city held by a larger garrison. The walls did the work. And here is the thing about Benedict Arnold that you cannot look away from, whatever you come to think of him later. He did not quit. Shot through the leg, unable to walk, commanding from a hospital bed, Arnold refused to lift the siege. With the shattered remnants of the army, a few hundred sick and freezing men, he maintained a nominal blockade of Quebec through the dead of the Canadian winter. When the ground proved too frozen to dig earthworks, he ordered his men to build fortifications out of the only material the wilderness had left in abundance. He had them build walls of snow and ice. Picture that. An army of ghosts, decimated by starvation and smallpox, its commander bleeding in a cot, laying siege to one of the strongest fortresses in North America from behind ramparts of frozen snow in January, refusing to admit that it was beaten. The siege was a slow horror. Smallpox kept sweeping the camp. There is an allegation, and it should be treated as exactly that, an allegation reported in some accounts and never proven, that British forces deliberately sent women infected with smallpox out into the American lines during truces to spread the disease. True or not, The disease spread regardless, and it killed men who had survived everything the wilderness could throw at them. Among the many who lived through the frozen march only to die of the virus in the camps outside Quebec was Daniel Judd, brother of Freeman Judd, whose journal had recorded the madness in the mountains. Think about the arithmetic of that grief. A man walks 350 miles through hell, eats his own shoes, watches his friends die against trees in the snow, survives all of it, and then dies of a pox in a tent within sight of the goal. The blockade dragged on through the winter and into the spring, sustained by Arnold's sheer refusal to let go. It finally collapsed in May of 1776, when a British relief fleet came up the St. Lawrence with the melting ice. With fresh British regulars pouring off the ships, the American position was hopeless, and the exhausted remnant of the invasion began a long, disastrous retreat back down the Lake Champlain corridor, the same corridor they had marched north to defend. The dream of the 14th colony was dead. Canada would stay British. By every measure that a general uses to judge a campaign, Arnold's expedition to Quebec had failed. It did not take the city. It did not win Canada. It did not add a 14th star to the flag. It cost hundreds of lives and gained, on the map, nothing at all. And yet, to stop the story here, at the failure, is to miss the strangest and most important thing about it. Because this failed march, this doomed assault, this frozen catastrophe, it may have saved the American Revolution anyway. Here is the paradox that military historians keep returning to. On its own terms, the Quebec expedition was a disaster. In the larger current of the war, it bought something the Americans could not have bought any other way: time. By projecting an armed force deep into British Canada, by making the impossible march and then hanging on outside Quebec through the winter, the Americans forced the British to react. The Crown had to pour vast resources into holding Quebec and then into mounting a counter-invasion south. Every regiment, every ship, every barrel of powder that Britain committed to dealing with the American presence in Canada was a resource not being used somewhere else, at a moment when the rebellion was desperately fragile. And then there is Arnold himself and what he did next, which flows directly out of the Quebec campaign. Driven back down the Lake Champlain corridor in 1776, Arnold did not simply retreat. He built a fleet. From almost nothing, on the shores of the lake, he threw together a scratched navy of gunboats and gondolas. And in October of 1776, at the Battle of Valcour Island, he threw that little fleet directly into the path of a far superior British force coming south. He lost. Of course he lost. He was outgunned and outsailed, and most of his fleet was destroyed or captured. But he lost slowly. He lost expensively. He fought a delaying action so stubborn and so costly that the British commander decided it was too late in the season to press on toward Albany, and pulled back to Canada to wait for spring. Arnold's defeat at Valcour Island bought the American cause a full year. A year in which the British advance down the Hudson was stalled. A year in which the Continental Army could regroup, rebuild, and prepare. And that year led straight to the hinge of the entire revolution. In 1777, the British finally launched their great southward thrust under General John Burgoyne. The campaign meant to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, the exact nightmare that had sent Arnold into the wilderness in the first place. It ended at Saratoga, and Saratoga was the turning point of the war, the American victory that convinced France to enter the conflict openly on the American side, which changed everything that followed. Now look at who was standing on the field at Saratoga. Benedict Arnold, whose reckless courage at Quebec and Valcour had bought the time to even fight the battle, and who fought at Saratoga with a brilliance and ferocity that many credit with winning it, and Daniel Morgan, Morgan, who had been captured in the streets of Quebec in that blizzard, had been held prisoner, been offered a commission in the British Army, and had thrown the offer back in their faces. He was eventually paroled and exchanged, promoted to colonel, and given command of a corps of riflemen. At Saratoga, Morgan's sharpshooters, the spiritual descendants of the men who had cut the path through the Maine wilderness, played a decisive role in bringing Burgoyne down. Trace the line. The frozen death march fails at Quebec, but it forges the men and buys the time that lead to Valcourt, and Valcourt buys the year that leads to Saratoga, and Saratoga brings in the French, and the French help win the war. The direct objective, Canada, was never taken. But the endurance, the delay, the sheer refusal to be destroyed, rippled outward through the next 2 years and helped secure the independence the whole enterprise had been launched to defend. Sometimes a campaign fails at everything it set out to do and succeeds at the only thing that turns out to matter. The men who ate their shoes in the mountains of Maine did not know they were buying the future, but they were. History remembers the march. It is less faithful to the men who made it. So before we close, let us follow them out of the wilderness and into the rest of their lives. Benedict Arnold. That name. In the winter of 1775, it belonged to the most daring commander in the American cause. A man who had captured Ticonderoga, crossed an impossible wilderness, run a killer river blind to save his own starving men, taken a musket ball in the leg and refused to leave the field, and laid siege to a fortress from behind walls of snow. If Arnold had died of that leg wound outside Quebec, he would be remembered today as one of the great heroes of the Revolution, his name on schools and streets and warships. Instead, he lived. He fought brilliantly at Valcourt and at Saratoga, was passed over and slighted and wounded again, nursed his grievances until they consumed him. And in 1780, he betrayed the cause he had bled for, plotting to hand West Point to the British. He escaped, took a British commission, and died in London 21 years later, belonging fully to neither side. It is one of the great tragedies of the era that the same relentless pride which drove him across the Maine wilderness and saved his men also drove him, in the end, into treason. The wilderness revealed the best of him. The years that followed revealed the rest. Daniel Morgan. The old wagoner walked out of the story better than almost anyone. Captured at Quebec, he refused the enemy's commission, was exchanged, and rose to become one of the finest battlefield tacticians the Americans produced. His riflemen helped break Burgoyne at Saratoga. And in 1781, at the Battle of Cowpens in the Carolinas, Morgan executed one of the most perfect tactical victories in American military history, luring and destroying a British force with a plan of almost geometric precision. The frontiersman with the scarred back and the 499th lash the crown still owed him lived to see independence won, and died an old man, respected in the country he had helped to free. Aaron Burr, the 19-year-old who had marched into the wilderness a scholar and helped lead the broken New York column away from the slaughter on the Quebec shoreline, went on to a career as brilliant and as ruinous as Arnold's in its own way. He became a senator, then vice president of the United States. And then, in 1804, he killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel and destroyed his own future. He would later be tried for treason himself and acquitted. The Revolution's wilderness marches produced heroes, and it produced men who could not stop fighting even their own side. Burr was both. The chroniclers, the men whose journals are the only reason we can tell this story at all, mostly lived and wrote and made sure the world would not forget. Henry Dearborn, whose careful daily record anchors so much of what we know, went on to a long career, eventually serving as Secretary of War. John Joseph Henry, the 16-year-old runaway, survived captivity and lived to write a vivid account of the ordeal as an older man. Dr. Isaac Center kept practicing medicine and kept the clinical record that tells us, in unflinching detail, exactly what starvation did to the bodies of these men. Without their pens, the eating of the dogs and the shoes and the shaving soap, the burial under leaves, the men dying against the trees, all of it would have vanished into the snow with them. And Roger Enos, the man who turned back. He was acquitted at his court-martial, the tribunal conceding the cold logic of the food supply. But acquittal is not the same as absolution. And Enos carried the word coward for the rest of his days, whatever the arithmetic said. He served on, quietly, in the war. But history filed him under betrayal. And there he has largely stayed, the officer who did the survivable thing and paid for it with his name. The two women, Mrs. Greer, who forded the ice-crusted pond with her skirts held high, and Jemima Warner, who buried her husband under leaves and shouldered his musket and walked 20 miles alone to rejoin the column. They slip out of the record after the march, as the poor and the female almost always did in the 18th century. We do not know, with certainty, what became of them. But we know what they did on that trail. And in a story crowded with generals and traders and future vice presidents, it may be that the truest portrait of courage the whole expedition offers is a widow, alone in the snow, picking up a gun and walking north. Victory writes its heroes in stone. Endurance writes its heroes in journals, if it writes them at all. These men and women earned a place in the second kind of memory. This video is, in its small way, an attempt to give it to them. Ask 100 people to name a battle of the American Revolution, and you will hear Lexington, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Yorktown. Almost no one will say the march to Quebec. Like the great forgotten battles of every war, it slipped out of popular memory. A failure on a map, in a country that would not even become part of the new nation, ending in a defeat in a blizzard. It is easy to see why the school books skipped it. But the reasons it is worth remembering are exactly the reasons it teaches better than the victories do. The first lesson is that logistics is destiny. This is the truth the whole story is built on. No British general defeated Arnold's army in the wilderness. A map defeated it. A batch of green pine boats defeated it. A miscalculated ration, made in comfort weeks before anyone went hungry, defeated it. Amateurs talk about courage and generals talk about tactics. But the men who actually run wars talk about supply. Because supply is the ground everything else stands on. Arnold's men had all the courage in the world. What they did not have was enough food, dry powder, and an accurate map. And no amount of courage can carry an army across a country that is 50 miles longer than its stomach. The second lesson is the compounding of small failures. No single mistake doomed this expedition. The map error alone might have been survivable. The bad boats alone might have been survivable. The storm alone, the drought alone, the flood alone, any one of them, a well-supplied army might have weathered. What destroyed half the force was the way they stacked. The bad map meant the march was too long. The too long march meant the food ran short. The bad boats meant even the food they had was ruined. The ruined food meant the men were already starving when the storm hit. The storm meant the food that was left washed away. Each failure made the next one deadlier. This is how real disasters happen. Not from one catastrophic decision, but from a chain of ordinary ones, each reasonable on its own, compounding into something no one intended and no one could stop. The third lesson is about the limits of leadership, and it lives in the twin truths of Benedict Arnold. Arnold's ferocious, reckless drive is the reason those men survived. No cautious commander would have run the Chaudière blind, or walked 60 miles to buy cattle, or kept a siege alive from a hospital bed behind walls of snow. And yet, that same drive, unchecked, curdled into the pride that made him a traitor. The qualities that make a great commander in a crisis are not always the qualities that make a good man in peacetime. And a nation that leans on brilliant, difficult, hungry men learns to live with that tension, or it learns the hard way. Arnold at Quebec and Arnold at West Point are the same man. That is the uncomfortable part. And the fourth lesson, the one that outlasts all the others, is about ordinary endurance. Strip away the strategy and the maps and the ripple into Saratoga, and what remains is simpler and larger than any of it. Then 700 human beings, starving, freezing, sick, betrayed by their tools and their weather and abandoned by a third of their own army, chose, day after day, in conditions that gave them every excuse to stop, to stand up and keep walking. They ate their dogs and did not stop. They ate their shoes and did not stop. They buried their friends under leaves and picked up the muskets and did not stop. That capacity, the plain animal refusal to lie down and die, is not a tactic and cannot be taught and does not show up in any casualty table. But it is the thing that carried the American cause through its darkest winters. Wars are won with powder and supply and geometry. But they are survived by people who simply will not quit. And this march is one of the purest portraits of that will that American history has ever produced. We began with a map, a 15-year-old map drawn by an enemy engineer that promised 180 miles. The map lied. The real distance was 350, and the difference between those two numbers was measured in dead men. 1,100 marched into the forest. Around 600 came out. The rest are still there, in a sense, scattered across the bogs and the mountains of Maine and the frozen ground outside Quebec. Men who ate their belts and read scripture over the dying and gave everything they had for a city they never took and a colony that never came. They failed. It is important to say that plainly, because the failure is part of the truth. They did not capture Quebec. They did not win Canada. Montgomery died in the snow. Arnold was carried bleeding from the field. Morgan surrendered in a maze of stone streets. And Canada stayed British for good. On the ledger of objectives, the frozen death march to Quebec accomplished nothing at all. And yet, it bought time. It tied down British armies, and it forged the men and the delay that led to Valcourt, and to Saratoga, and to the French alliance, and to Yorktown, and to independence. The march that failed at everything it aimed at succeeded at the one thing history needed from it. Sometimes that is how it works. Sometimes the impossible march does not win the battle. It just buys the year that wins the war. The ruins of the old forts are quiet now. The rivers still run down out of the mountains of Maine, cold and fast and indifferent, over the same rocks that split the green pine boats 2.5 centuries ago. There are no monuments in most of that country. No plaques mark the spot where Jemima Warner buried her husband under leaves, or where Dearborn's dog was eaten to the bone, or where a nameless soldier sat down against a tree in the snow and listened to the Bible and let go. The wilderness does not remember them. The wilderness never does. But we can. Because somewhere in every hard winter, in every impossible task that a human being is asked to see through past the point of reason, there is an echo of that column, starving, freezing, betrayed, and still moving north through the trees. They were not the strongest army, or the best supplied, or the best led. They were simply men and women who had every reason on earth to stop and who would not. The map had promised one thing. The land had answered with another. And in the end, so did they. They marched anyway.